Hello friends, and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start as usual with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join in if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome to today's Sutta class. Today we are reading a sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. We are reading the Potaliya Sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya number 54. And this is a very beautiful sutta, I think, because in this sutta we have the Buddha talking to a householder named Potaliya. And Potaliya is somebody who thinks that they are basically that they're also practicing a spiritual path. They believe that they are already an ascetic or living like a monk, when actually they are living quite like in the middle of luxury, and they're living a quite standard lay life. But they have this delusion or this deceit that they are already very ascetic and that they are very committed spiritual practitioner. So the Buddha kind of gently talks to them and tells them what spiritual practice actually involves. And so I think this is a very beautiful sutta, also a very relatable sutta, because I think also nowadays we can see a lot of people who say, well, I'm not ordained, but basically I live like a monk. Basically, there's no difference between me and somebody who is actually living a spiritual life. So I feel like in the Buddha's day, this happened, and also nowadays, this is very common. And this is a sutta where the Buddha really tells us what spiritual practice actually involves. And so I feel like this is really beautiful and really relatable. And hopefully you will also enjoy this sutta. And the sutta also has some very beautiful similes about attachment to sensual pleasures. They're very famous. So once we get to that part, I think most people will recognize that. It's repeated in many other suttas also. But the sutta is also a bit long, so probably it will take maybe 2 weeks to finish. Probably we will not be able to finish it today. We will see. So I have put a link in the live chat if you want to read along, a link to Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. I will also be reading from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And yeah, let's just get started. And the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the country of the Anguttarappans, where there was a town of theirs named Apana. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, went into Apana for alms. When he had wandered for alms in Apana, and had returned from his alms round, after his meal, he went to a certain grove for the day's abiding. Having entered the grove, he sat down at the root of a tree. So here we have a standard sutta opening. We have seen this in many other suttas too. The Buddha is in a certain place, and then he goes on alms round, and then he hopes to spend the rest of the day in seclusion, in meditation. So he has this plan to meditate for the rest of the afternoon, but that plan is foiled by Potaliya, who comes and wants to have a chat with the Buddha. So the Buddha is not actually able to meditate. So Potaliya, the householder, while walking and wandering for exercise, wearing full dress with parasol and sandals, also went to the grove. And having entered the grove, he went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he stood at one side. The Blessed One said to him, "There are seats, householder. Sit down if you like." When this was said, the householder Potaliya thought, The recluse Gautama addresses me as householder. And angry and displeased, he remained silent. A second time, the Blessed One said to him, "There are seats, householder, sit down if you like." And a second time, the householder Potaliya thought, "The recluse Gautama addresses me as householder." And angry and displeased, he remained silent. A third time, the Blessed One said to him, "There are seats, householder, sit down if you like." When this was said, the householder Potaliya thought, "The recluse Gautama addresses me as householder." And angry and displeased, he said to the Blessed One, "Master Gautama, it is neither fitting nor proper that you address me as householder." So here we have Potaliya, and he comes, he's just wandering around randomly. He's just going for a walk or something. And he comes to where the Buddha is, and so he stops by to have a chat. And here we can see from the description of Potaliya that he is very, very wealthy. So we see his description. He's wearing full dress with parasol and sandals. So based on this description, listeners back in the Buddha's day, if they heard this sutta, they would have known that these are symbols, or these are signs that this person is very wealthy. So, for example, we have many stories in the Vinaya, in the monastic code, in the collection of monastic rules, where we have rules about monks and nuns. For example, they're not supposed to wear or to carry a parasol unless they're sick, because a parasol is a symbol for somebody who is very, very wealthy, or for a king, or maybe a very rich householder. And also wearing sandals was a symbol for somebody who was quite wealthy. Most people, ordinary people, would just wear barefoot back in the day, and also in the early days, monks and nuns would walk barefoot. And only after a certain time, when people were sick and it was very difficult for them to walk barefoot, the Buddha allowed shoes. But even then, there are many rules what kind of footwear is allowed for monastics. It has to be very simple. It can't be in too many colors. It can't be too fancy. So we have a lot of rules concerning these signs, because as monastics, we should present an appearance that is very modest and very simple. And so from a description like this, a person with those kind of sandals and a parasol and so on, we can see that this must be quite a rich person. And also the description that this person wears full dress shows us that they must be quite influential. Back in the day, the people would wear clothing that is fairly similar to what monastics still wear nowadays. So an upper robe and a lower robe. But they would look quite different from the monks' clothing. The colors would be different. The way of wrapping the cloth around would be quite different. And lay people usually would have multicolored garments. They would have, especially the rich ones, would have robes, or would have clothing that was embroidered and that was very fancy and very decorated. So it was even though the style was quite similar, like the cutting and the patterns were quite similar, it was very, very obvious back in the day who was a householder and who was a monastic. And also the description that he's wearing full dress shows us that he is not a poor person, because poor people would often just wear a lower robe, because cloth was very expensive. So they would be bare-chested, and they wouldn't cover the upper part of the body, only the lower part of the body. While for rich people, it was considered very, very inappropriate to only cover the lower part of the body. For example, we have a story in the Vinaya, and that is a story that that also explains to us a little bit about the social customs back in the day. And then in that story, there was a monk, and a layman came to him, and that layman said, or made an offering, made an invitation, and said, "If you ever need a robe, please let me know, and I will provide that robe for you." And the monk was very happy. And then after a while, sometime later, he did need a robe. And it so happened that on that particular day, when it popped into his mind that I should replace my robe, that same layman was also in the monastery and happened to visit him. And then the monastic, that monk, informed him that he needed the robe. And he said, please give me a robe. And the layman said, oh, yeah, I will have one prepared and I will send it to you tomorrow. And obviously that is a very, very, very kind reaction, also very, very generous. And it's very quick to prepare a robe within one day, because a robe it needs a lot of cloth. Cloth was very expensive, and you have to cut it in a specific pattern. You have to sew it in a specific pattern, so it takes a long time to make a robe. So making a robe within 24 hours is a very generous offer. But that monk wasn't happy at all, and he scolded the layman, and he said to him, well, you said you'll offer a robe, but now you don't want to give me a robe. You want to delay and delay. Why don't you give it to me straight away? And the layman said, I don't have it now. How can I give one right now? And so the monk said, well, just give me that one that you're wearing now. So he asked for the clothing that the layman was wearing right at that moment. And then the layman said, well, I can't give you this one because of my social status. I cannot walk around bare-chested. That would be really, really inappropriate for somebody from my social class. And the monk kept on bullying and kept on shaming him. And so eventually that layman gave that robe to the monk and went back wearing only a lower robe, so wearing only like a skirt. And then everybody who saw him on the way, first of all, they almost didn't recognize him. And then when they did recognize him, they all asked him what had happened. And he told the story, and everybody was, and the Sangha got a really bad reputation from that story, because everybody was complaining how inappropriate the behavior was to deprive the layman of his robe, and how demanding it is to not be able to wait for 24 hours to have a robe prepared. So, and then the rule was laid down that this kind of behavior is inappropriate. So from that story, we can see that somebody who's wearing full dress also means that this must be a fairly high-ranking, fairly influential, very rich person here that is described. So as I mentioned back in the day, such a description, somebody wearing full dress with a parasol and sandals, that would have meant that the audience understands immediately this is a really, really rich person. For us nowadays, maybe we will need a little bit of explanation to understand. But Potaliya comes to the Buddha, and he really looks like somebody who is very, very rich and definitely a householder, not a monastic, because as a monastic, you wouldn't wear these kind of symbols, status symbols. So he exchanges greetings with the Buddha, and then he just stands there. So obviously he has come to the Buddha, and he is being a bit provocative. He seems to be trying to pick a fight. He's not willing to sit down. He's just standing there, and the Buddha obviously is sitting on the ground because the Buddha has been meditating. So that layman, Potaliya, is just looming over the Buddha and not behaving in a particularly courteous or particularly friendly way towards the Buddha. So, and the Buddha offers him a seat, and Potaliya refuses to sit down. The reason why Potaliya refuses to sit down is because he feels that the Buddha is addressing him inappropriately, because the Buddha is calling him a householder, since he looks like a householder displaying all his status symbols. And Potaliya obviously seems to be somebody who gets angry very, very quickly, because he gets really upset about being called a householder. And so he is not willing to sit down. And he's also not willing to say anything to the Buddha. He just keeps on fuming silently inside and not replying at all. So the Buddha invites him to sit down, and he doesn't reply, and he doesn't sit down. He just keeps on standing there, looking down at the Buddha. And I imagine there must have been a very awkward silence. And so the Buddha repeats his invitation to sit down again. But Potaliya just gets even more angry, because again, he is addressed as a householder, but still he doesn't reply. He's just like silently boiling with anger and rage. And eventually, when the Buddha invites him the third time, he can't contain it anymore. And he scolds the Buddha and just blurts out that it's really inappropriate the way the Buddha addresses him. As he says, it's neither fitting nor proper to address me as a householder. So already we can see he seems to be very easily provocable, and it seems that right from the start he just went there to pick a fight, because right from the start he wasn't willing to sit down. He just was standing there, and that's obviously quite discourteous, quite provocative behavior. And we also see the Buddha remains calm throughout. The exchange hasn't even really started yet, but the Buddha has remained calm the whole time. And even before the conversation has started, Potaliya is already boiling and raging inside. So we can clearly see how that conversation is going to go, and who is basically keeping his cool and who has already lost his composure. And so then the Buddha says to him, "Householder, you have the aspects, marks, and signs of a householder." So the Buddha points out to him, well, it's no wonder that I call you a householder, because you really look like a householder. You don't look like any other kind of member of society. You don't look like an ascetic. You don't look like a renunciant. So obviously you must be a layperson. And for that reason, I call you a householder. And Potaliya says, "Nevertheless, Master Gotama, I have given up all my works and cut off all my affairs." So Potaliya indicates that he thinks he has let go of all household duties, but also of all attachments to household life. So Potaliya indicates that he thinks he is a fairly accomplished spiritual practitioner. And we can see he's also very, very attached to that identity, to the point that he gets angry if somebody doesn't recognize that identity, and to the point where he gets angry if somebody just merely calls him a householder. So we can see maybe he believes he is a spiritual practitioner, but he has very, very strong views and very strong attachment here. But he makes this claim that he has already given up all attachments to his household life. He has cut off all his affairs. So the Buddha asks, "In what way, householder, have you given up all your works and cut off all your affairs?" And Potaliya says, "Master Gotama, I have given all my wealth, grain, silver, and gold, to my children as their inheritance. I do not advise or blame them about such matters, but merely live on food and clothing. That is how I have given up all my works and cut off all my affairs." So Potaliya says that he has given up all his assets, all his money, and all his possessions, has handed them over to his children, and he is no longer involved in the way that they run the household or the way they run the business. He doesn't praise or blame them. He doesn't advise them. He doesn't meddle in their affairs. And he believes that this is enough to count as a renunciant and to count as a spiritual practitioner. And also he believes that this is enough to sever attachments to the world and to be sort of detached and free from all like worldly bondages or worldly fetters. So the Buddha sees that there is a little bit of wrong view there. And he says, "Householder, the cutting off of affairs as you describe it is one thing, but in the noble one's discipline, the cutting off of affairs is different." So now the Buddha points out to Potaliya that maybe there is another way of practice. And finally, he does get Potaliya's interest, because this is something that obviously Potaliya identifies with. And so if you can talk about this particular thing that interests him, then now he is willing to engage in a discussion. And so Potaliya says, "What is the cutting off of affairs like? In the noble one's discipline, Venerable Sir, it would be good, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma, showing what the cutting off of affairs is like in the noble one's discipline." So now he requests a teaching from the Buddha. So he is no longer so confrontational. Now he is actually finally willing to listen to the Buddha. And we also see how he changes the way he talks to the Buddha. So this whole time he has called the Buddha Master Gotama, or sometimes even the recluse Gotama. But now he's calling him Venerable Sir. So he's becoming a lot more polite and a lot more friendly. And now it seems that the Buddha has managed to kind of calm him down and also to open his mind at least a little bit, so that it is possible for the Buddha to start filling it up a little bit with his own Dhamma. So the Buddha says, "Then listen, householder, and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," Potaliya the householder replied. The Blessed One said this: "Householder, there are these 8 things in the Noble One's discipline that lead to the cutting off of affairs. What are the 8? With the support of the non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned. With the support of taking only what is given, the taking of what is not given is to be abandoned. With the support of truthful speech, false speech is to be abandoned. With the support of unmalicious speech, malicious speech is to be abandoned. With the support of no rapacity and greed are to be abandoned. With the support of no spite and scolding are to be abandoned. With the support of no anger and irritation are to be abandoned. With the support of non-arrogance, arrogance is to be abandoned. These are the 8 things, stated in brief, without being expounded in detail, that lead to the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline." So obviously, the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline means completely severing all fetters that tie us to samsara. So the cutting off of affairs obviously is a synonym for arahantship in the Buddha's teaching. And so the Buddha says there are 8 things that we need to practice, or that Potaliya needs to practice, in order to be able to cut off all affairs, so to make spiritual progress and basically to become an arahant. And then he gives a list of 8 things here. In this list of 8 things is quite unusual because we have a lot of lists of 8 in Buddhism, but this one is not really found in any other sutta. So this is one that is really specifically tailored to Potaliya and his particular situation. So in Buddhism, we have various lists of 8 things that we should practice, that are beneficial, that might lead to arahantship and so on. For example, the Noble Eightfold Path, or the 8 precepts, or other things that come in groups of 8. But this particular group here is quite unusual, and I don't think this is found in many other suttas. So let's have a look. So the first thing that the Buddha talks about, obviously, is not killing living beings. So this, of course, is the first precept, and I think we're all familiar with it. And clearly, not killing is something that is very, very fundamental on the path. It's quite obvious, quite easy to understand why the Buddha would start with this particular teaching. And then the second one that the Buddha talks about is not to take what is not given, so not stealing. And again, this is the second precept. And again, we can all understand how this is very fundamental and why the Buddha would start teaching Potaliya about this. Then the third thing that the Buddha talks about here is truthful speech, or not lying. And this is the fourth precept. So already we see that he isn't following the usual order of the precepts. He is kind of mixing it up and mixing and matching and picking different things from different places to put them into a unique list of 8 things here. So now he's talking about the fourth precept, not lying. And of course, not lying is very, very fundamental on the path. Sometimes people have a little difficulty practicing this precept about not lying. Sometimes people think there should be white lies, so there should be allowances for lying occasionally. But of course, not lying is such a fundamental precept that it's really important that we keep it, because when we lie, basically, we are trying to deceive others. We are adding to delusion in the world. We are trying to let others not see the reality as it actually is. We are trying to obscure the truth and not let the truth be obvious and out in the open. We're trying to, as I mentioned, to deceive others, and that, of course, is a function of the delusion that we have in our mind. So it is because we have all this delusion in our mind, because we ourselves cannot see clearly, and because that delusion that we have keeps on deceiving us and not letting us see clearly the reality as it actually is, why we have this desire to also deceive others. So if we lie, the overall delusion in the world just keeps on increasing, and the overall difficulty of practicing the Dhamma keeps on increasing. So we are basically preventing others from seeing the truth clearly, but we are also increasing our own delusion and increasing our own defilements in the mind. And that will just create a huge barrier for ourselves and a huge hindrance for us to actually develop insight and wisdom. Because if we have a lot of delusion in our mind, then it's very difficult to develop insight practices and to understand reality as it actually is. So the more we create delusions in the world, the more we fool ourselves and others, the more difficult it becomes to make a commitment to truth and to actually understand reality as it actually is, to actually understand the Four Noble Truths. So it's not an accident that the Buddha called his experiences the Four Noble Truths, because it is a direct antidote to the delusion, the fundamental delusion that keeps us trapped in samsara. And so for this reason, of course, the Buddha includes truthful speech here in this list of things to be practiced, because this is so fundamental. And for this reason also, if you feel you have a desire to tell a white lie, it's always good to reflect on the Four Noble Truths and why they're called truths, because it is so important to make a commitment to not strengthen the delusion that we have in our mind, but to make a commitment to true knowledge and to clear seeing, which is obviously based on truth, not on lying. So that, for that reason, the Buddha included this precept here. And then the fourth thing that he talks about is unmalicious speech. So this is quite interesting, I think, because, as I mentioned, he's not going through the usual order of the 5 precepts, but he's also not using the usual teaching of the 4 kinds of right speech. So usually in so many other suttas, in so many other lists, we find the 4 kinds of right speech. And the first one of those 4 obviously is not lying. The second one is not talking in malicious ways. So not trying to create conflict, not trying to split people from each other. And the third one is no harsh speech. And the fourth one is not gossiping, or no idle chatter, no random chit-chat that has no benefit. So these are the usual 4 things that almost always come together in one list. It's very unusual to only see 2 of those 4. But here in this particular list, the Buddha has only included not lying and no malicious speech. And he has not included no harsh speech, and he has not included no gossiping. And I think one reason why he has included malicious speech here and not the other things is because this teaching is directly tailored for Potaliya himself. And of course, Potaliya seems to have a real problem with anger and a real problem with the speech precepts, or with angry, resentful speech. So as we have seen in this short exchange that he had with the Buddha so far, he got provoked very, very easily. He came to the Buddha trying to pick a fight in the first place, and then he got provoked very easily, and he scolded the Buddha. And it was very obvious, I think very obvious to the Buddha, or very obvious to any kind of Dharma teacher, that if a person behaves like this, they obviously have a problem with right speech, and they seem to have a very big anger issue also. So for that reason, I think because the Buddha tailors this teaching directly for Potaliya, he points out that this is one of his biggest flaws, and that this is something that he needs to pay special attention to. And I think for this reason, he picked out the particular point about not speaking maliciously, because Potalya has a really big issue with that. And then the fifth thing that the Buddha talks about here is about rapacity and greed. So actually, I didn't know what rapacity is, so I had to look it up in the dictionary. And if anybody is listening who also doesn't know what it is, it seems to mean a kind of greed, a very, very strong kind of greed, basically a violent form of greed, a greed that is so strong that it takes you to acts of violence. So anyway, it's just basically another form of greed. So now the Buddha is talking about mental states. So the first four factors that the Buddha was talking about, those are actions that we can do with the body or actions we can do with speech. But now the Buddha is focusing on the internal things we need to work on. So the mental qualities or the mental defilements that need to be abandoned on the pathway to arahantship, so on the way to cutting off all these affairs. So the first thing that we need to work on is greed. Of course, this is very familiar to us. The usual way of presenting this would be in terms of greed, hatred, and delusion. So only 3 factors. But here in this list, the Buddha uses or breaks down the mental defilements into 4 factors. This is also quite unusual, and this is also because he's talking to Potalya, and because Potalya needs, and because the Buddha focuses on Potalya's special needs, Potalya's most important defilements. So the first one he is talking about is greed. Greed, attraction to things, attachments. These are, of course, things we need to abandon. I think everybody is very clear. And of course, greed covers a wide range of different defilements, all under this, basically the heading of greed. So that can be various kinds of attachments, from the grossest level to the most subtle level, including even attachments to jhana realms, attachments to immaterial realms. These are very, very subtle forms of greed, but also the very gross ones, attachments to sensual pleasures, attachments to food, to music, to sex, to whatever, attachment to people, attachment to our body. So all these come under the heading of greed. So this is the 5th quality that the Buddha talks about. And then the 6th one is spite and scolding. So spite and scolding, usually we would think that these should be under the kind of umbrella term of hatred or anger. But here the Buddha singles them out, and he specifically assigns a separate category to spite and scolding. And I think, again, this is because Potalya obviously has a really big issue with scolding other people. He even goes up to the Buddha and starts scolding the Buddha. So basically, even before he had any kind of meaningful exchange with the Buddha, he already started criticizing the Buddha, scolding him, telling him that his behavior is inappropriate, just because the Buddha called him a householder. So because of a very, very minor kind of way, like a form of address, basically, Potalya already got very angry and started scolding the Buddha. So it was very obvious that this is a huge issue, a huge mental problem for Potalya. And for that reason, I think the Buddha singles this out and doesn't treat it as usual, just under the heading of hatred or anger, but gives Potalya a separate category so that it doesn't become a blind spot for him, so that it's really out in the open, so that it's really obvious to Potalya that this is something he needs to look into. So, and then the 7th one that the Buddha talks about is anger and irritation. This is, of course, the standard one, as I mentioned. So basically, the Buddha has broken this into 2 parts. One is the usual anger and irritation, and the other one is just spite and scolding. And then the last one that the Buddha talks about is arrogance. So arrogance or conceit, obviously, this is also something we abandon when we get close to arahantship. And In Potaliya's case, obviously, the Buddha again singles this out as a specific factor for Potaliya, something that he really needs to look into, something that seems to be a really big blind spot for him, because Potaliya obviously seems to be very, very arrogant. The way he is treating the Buddha, the way he's just walking up to him, refusing to sit down, just standing there, looming over the Buddha, talking down to the Buddha. And then the way he's interacting with the Buddha as though they're on the same level, as though they have both made the same kind of renunciation, the same kind of commitment to a spiritual path, as though there really isn't any difference between a fully enlightened Buddha and Potaliya, who just managed to transfer a few assets to his children, as though they were really on the same level. That really shows a huge amount of delusion, but also a huge amount of arrogance on the part of Potaliya. And so for that reason, I think the Buddha singles this out specifically as one factor for Potaliya to look into. And so the Buddha says he has given these 8 factors, these 8 things in brief, but he has not yet expounded them in detail. So he's basically just giving Potaliya a tiny snippet, like a trailer, basically. And if you basically invites Potaliya to ask more, and if Potaliya now is interested and ask a question, then Buddha will give him the extended version of the Dhamma talk instead of just this brief summary. And of course, Potaliya takes the bait, and Potaliya says, "Venerable Sir, it would be good if out of compassion, the Blessed One would expound to me in detail these 8 things that lead to the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline, which having been stated in brief by the Blessed One without being expounded in detail. Then listen, householder, and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," Potaliya the householder replied. The Blessed One said this. So the Buddha says, "With the support of the non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned." So it was said. And with reference to what was this said, here a noble disciple considers thus: "I'm practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters, because of which I might kill living beings. If I were to kill living beings, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so. And on the dissolution of the body after death, because of killing living beings, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this killing of living beings is itself a fetter and a hindrance. And while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through the killing of living beings, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from killing living beings. So it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of the non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned." So the Buddha here picks up the first of the 8 things again, or he's going through all of the 8 things, but he of course goes through the first one first, which was killing of living beings, and he explains in a little more detail how we practice with this first factor. And so the first thing that the Buddha says is that we need to properly reflect about this. So we need to consider this in detail, basically. So the first thing that this noble disciple here reflects about is that they have to practice in such a way that they can abandon and cut off the fetters because of which they might kill living beings. So the first thing that I reflect about is not the act in itself, but is the underlying cause because of which they would kill living beings. So it's the mental defilement that would bring us to the physical act of killing another. So of course, those mental defilements can be different ones. Basically, they're usually either based in greed or they're based in hatred. So for example, we might be very angry with somebody, we might be totally overcome with rage, or very, very hateful towards somebody, and then we just kill them. That is one reason. Or another reason is we are very greedy. They have something that we want, and we absolutely really believe that we need to have it, so we just kill them so that we can take the thing. So there might be various underlying mental defilements, and those defilements are the actual problem. Because as long as we still have those defilements, we might make an effort now to refrain from the physical act. But if we don't give up those defilements, at any point in the future, we could, if we are not mindful, we could still kill another being. But if we give up those underlying mental factors, then of course there is no need for too much mindfulness, because if we don't have the defilement anymore, we wouldn't kill another being anyway. And for that reason, of course, it is also said that arahants naturally keep all the precepts. Arahants don't need to be careful with the precepts. They naturally keep them at all times, because they don't have the defilements that would bring them to, or that would make them kill another being. So this is the first reflection that the Buddha talks about here. And then the second reflection that the Buddha talks about is this idea that we reflect, if I did kill somebody, I would blame myself. So afterwards, I would feel very guilty. I would have a lot of remorse. I would think that that was very badly done. So I would like not have any kind of mental peace. I would be very tormented, because I myself would think that that was really, really bad. And other people, wise people, would blame me for that, or would criticize me for that. So this is basically the idea of what we call in Pali hiri and ottappa, so sometimes translated into English as shame and fear of wrongdoing. These are the translations that Bhikkhu Bodhi uses. And this is basically the idea. So hiri or shame is the idea that I myself, with my own conscience, would think that this is a bad thing to do. And ottappa, or translated as fear of wrongdoing, is the idea that other people would criticize me for this, like wise people would criticize me for this. So as humans, we are kind of social animals. We always want to be approved of by other people. We want to be liked by other people, especially by people we look up to or people we think are good people. And so we don't want to be criticized by such people. And for that reason, it is just thinking that they would criticize this can make us abstain or refrain from doing bad actions. So these two ideas, shame and fear of wrongdoing, or hiri and ottappa, can stop us from killing beings. Even if we still have that tendency in our mind, we can refrain from the physical act by using these kind of reflections. And then a third reflection we can use is that obviously killing living beings creates a lot of bad karma, and that would lead to a bad rebirth. So because we don't want to have a bad rebirth, that can also make us refrain from killing other beings. And then there is yet another reflection that the Buddha suggests that we do, and that is what he is translated as: this killing of living beings is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through the killing of living beings, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from killing living beings. So this maybe needs a little bit of explanation, that the killing of living beings is itself a fetter or a hindrance, because it is not a fetter or a hindrance in the usual sense. So of course, we have a list, the usual 10 fetters or the 5 hindrances, and these 10 fetters or 5 hindrances don't include killing of living beings as one of the 10 or one of the 5. But what this means is that if we kill living beings, this will strengthen the fetters and it will strengthen the hindrances. The hindrances stop us from meditating properly. They make our mind very agitated, and they stop us from entering the jhanas, so higher states of mind or higher states of samadhi. And the fetters are the ones that sort of keep us bound to samsara and that kind of stop us from attaining higher stages or higher attainments on the path. So if we kill living beings, then these fetters and these hindrances will be strengthened. And because if we kill living beings, there's so much unwholesome karma that we create, and there are so many mental defilements that get stirred up. It's basically like a whole tsunami of bad emotions follow in the wake of the killing. So first of all, there will be a lot of greed, or there will be a lot of anger and hatred. And afterwards, there will be a lot of shame. There will be a lot of remorse. There will be a lot of negative mental consequences. And all this just creates more greed, more hatred, and more delusion in our mind. All this strengthens the fetters. All this strengthens the hindrances. And for that reason, this tsunami of defilements kind of makes our mind very agitated. And the Buddha points out that if we abstain from killing, then the mind can be a lot more calmer, and pains, vexations, and fever don't arise in the mind. So all these are reflections that we can do in order to practice with these first of these 8 things that the Buddha has given to Potaliya. And then the Buddha goes through the other 7 things in exactly the same way. So he's going through not stealing, truthful speech, unmalicious speech, rapacity and greed, or no rapacity and greed, no spite and scolding, no anger and irritation, and then non-arrogance, and explains it all in exactly the same way. First, to reflect that you need to abandon the underlying tendencies that cause you to act in that way. Then to think about hiri and ottappa, so the consequences of such actions. First, you would feel remorseful yourself, other people would criticize you, and you would create bad karma that would lead you to a bad rebirth. And then finally, you reflect that this will just strengthen the hindrances and the fetters, and keep you bound to samsara, and impede your progress on the path. So in this way, here the Buddha goes through all of these 8 things that he has given to Potaliya. And then he says, these 8 things that lead to the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline have now been expounded in detail. But the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline has not yet been achieved entirely and in all ways. So again, the Buddha says, so now I have explained in detail how to do it, but still there is more that should be explained. So he's giving him another kind of bait, and he's trying to get Potaliya to ask more and to learn more about this thing. So he's trying to get Potaliya involved. And so clearly the Buddha has more that he thinks would be beneficial for Potaliya. Clearly the Buddha is willing to teach him more if Potaliya is willing to listen. And so at this point, I think we are going to finish for today, and we will keep on reading the sutta next time, because I think this is a very good place to stop for today. And now if you have any questions or comments, then you can type them in the live chat, and I will see if I can answer them. So far, I don't see too many questions or comments, only one. So Sud has a question. And they say, even if we give these things up intellectually, these defilements like anger and conceit still exist in the mind. How does one give them up completely so they don't arise again? Well, the first thing is to do these reflections, as the Buddha says, to really, really deeply understand where the problem lies, because only then do we have the motivation to actually practice. And then another thing is that we actively cultivate the opposite in our daily life. So it's not enough to just meditate. It has to be a commitment 24 hours a day. We need to practice in our daily life too. So let's say somebody has a real problem with anger and conceit. But since these are the 2 defilements you mentioned, so let's take them as an example. Somebody has a real problem with anger and with conceit. And because they reflect on this a lot, and because they have observed their own mind, they have recognized, yes, I have a real problem with anger and with conceit. So in their daily life, they actively need to practice the opposite. So if they are generally a very angry person, then they make an active effort to be especially kind to other people, to be especially compassionate, to act in very loving ways towards others. They make a very mindful effort that in a situation where they would usually get angry, they refrain. First of all, they refrain from expressing their anger, so they don't shout at other people. And then if there are persons that are especially difficult, in their meditation, they can practice metta, but outside their meditation, they can also act towards those people in a friendly way. Or if that is not possible, they can try to avoid interacting with those people too much, so that the anger doesn't get triggered all the time. Because each time you trigger anger, it just gets worse. You feed the defilements and the defilement gets stronger. And the same with conceit. If you have a real problem with conceit, then make an active effort to listen to other people, even if you think you are better than them. Actually make an active effort to get to know them, to listen to them, maybe even go along with their ideas, with their plans. Even if you think that your one is better, just give it a try, and maybe you will see that other people's ideas and plans aren't might be equally good, as good as yours, so it might maybe even better if you try it out. So actively act in ways that directly counteract those problems that you have identified in your mind. And then in your meditation, of course, you can either again cultivate the antidotes to your problem. So if your problem is anger, then cultivate a lot of metta, for example. Or you can do insight meditation practices. You can investigate your anger. You can try to understand how it arises. You can see that this is just an empty process. It has nothing to do with you. You can try to slowly dissolve all those defilements that are stuck in your mind. But really, it's not just about meditation. It's really a whole life practice that needs to also be done in your daily life. And it is not a quick process. It needs time. So also patience is a very, very important factor on the path. So other than that, I don't see any further question at the moment. Pial and Indira have posted a question, and they say, this is more like Buddha teaching on emotional intelligence to Potaliya. Recognize the underlying cause, express it appropriately, etc. What is your take on it? I think a lot of Buddhist practice actually is about emotional intelligence, learning how to regulate our own emotions so they don't trigger us, and so that they don't overwhelm us. This is very often the first step. And especially Potaliya, he is obviously very, very new to practice. So he is one of those typical people who think they already know everything, and they have already made this huge commitment, and they are already very knowledgeable and very well practiced, when actually they don't know much. But they're one of those typical people where the cup is already completely full, and it's very difficult to fill in more knowledge into their cup. So the first step very often on the path is to learn about emotional intelligence, learn to regulate our own emotions. And this is very important, that we learn to regulate our own emotions. Or first of all, to get in touch with our emotions, because many people can't even feel their emotions. They can't even feel if they're angry or anything. Get in touch with them, learn to understand them, learn to regulate them. And only after we have learned even these basic skills of dealing with emotions can we actually hope to dig deeper and to completely let go of the greed, the hatred, and the delusion that is underlying all these emotions that trigger us. So definitely emotional intelligence is a very important step, but it's not the only step, but it is a very important step. And Amaranta says they also have an anger problem. So very good. It's good that you recognize that. Then you can practice with it. It's much more difficult if you don't recognize it, because if you have a blind spot, then obviously you can't do anything about it. But if you see it, then you can actually practice with it. So of course, knowledge is the first step in order to grow. So very good that you made this observation. And Sud has a follow-up, and they say, so just persistently abstaining from engaging in defilements, you're slowly eliminating them. Is this the correct way to understand it? So eventually, without acting on them, they fade away. In some way, yes. So if you stop feeding into the defilements every day, then they sort of calm down a little bit. So your mind becomes a lot more quiet if they don't get triggered all the time. And once your mind becomes a lot more quiet because your emotions don't get triggered all the time, or because your defilements don't get triggered all the time, and your mind is more quiet, then you can really start making progress in your meditation. Then you can really start making insights and understanding how the mind works and how those defilements work. And it is actually the understanding, the insight, the wisdom that will enable you to cut off the defilements. But you can only make those insights if your mind is calm enough, and your mind is only calm enough if your defilements don't constantly get triggered. Which is why the Buddha recommends to live a very calm and simple life, which is why the Buddha recommends to people who are very committed practitioners, especially monastics, that they withdraw from society a little bit, that they go into nature, that they go into a quiet place, and they are focused on the meditation instead of doing it right in the middle of a busy society and busy household life, because there is just too much going on, and the mind just, for most people, doesn't get quiet enough to enable you to actually make deep insights. So abstaining is a good first step, but eventually wisdom is also necessary for the complete cutting off. So that seems to have been the last question for today. So I hope you enjoyed this sutta. Next time we will continue. And for today, we can finish with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I will see you all next week. Have a good day and have a good week.